Hello and welcome to this edition of Arirang News. I'm Lee-Jun in Seoul. The risk of a trade war between the U.S. and the European Union seems to be growing by the minute, as the EU threatened to retaliate against Washington over U.S. President Donald Trump's proposed tariffs on steel and aluminum. Meanwhile, Trump is expected to formalize the details of his tariff proposal, including any exemptions, and sign off on the measures by the end of this week. There are concerns that a trade war between world superpowers could hurt all sides, including producers and consumers, as well as Korea. And today we sit down with an expert for a more in-depth discussion on this issue. But first, let's check out the top stories at this hour with our Devin Whiting at the News Center. Devin.
Hi, Jiyoon. South Korea's presidential envoys are now heading to Washington to discuss the outcome of their North Korea trip with their U.S. counterparts. The meetings will be critical in the next phase of the latest détente with North Korea, that is, talks between Pyongyang and Washington. Our chief Blue House correspondent Mnuchin explains.
2 days after they returned from a historic trip to North Korea, South Korea's chief presidential envoys headed for the U.S. on Thursday to meet officials there and discuss the outcome of their meeting with North Korean leader Kim Jongun earlier in the week.
At this point, I cannot discuss any details of this trip, but the most urgent issue for us is to make sure the United States and North Korea will engage in talks.
President Moon Jae-in's directors of National Security Office and National Intelligence Service are scheduled to meet with their U.S. counterparts over the next 2 days, and possibly even President Donald Trump. U.S. officials will be looking to see if the South Chung Eui-yong and Seo-hun reaffirm that the North Kim has promised to refrain from nuclear missile tests and to engage in negotiations on giving up its nuclear arsenal if its security is guaranteed.
Obviously, we're cautiously optimistic that there's some forward progress here, but we've been optimistic before, so we're going to have to watch actions and see if they match words.
That much was announced by the South Koreans upon return from their Pyongyang trip earlier in the week, but the South Korean leader's chief envoys have said they're carrying additional offers from North Korea's Kim Jongun to pass on to U.S. President Donald Trump. They didn't announce what the plus alpha entails, but local media in South Korea are raising speculations. Among them, Pyongyang's vow to halt its development of intercontinental ballistic missiles, but dependent on, quote, U.S. attitude to the release of 3 U.S. citizens detained in the reclusive state. If Washington takes up on the offer, the American step likely will be to ask the North Koreans to directly reiterate that position, which could be done through a special envoy from North Korean leader Kim Jongun.
Now, if that's reaffirmed by North Korea, it would probably represent a sufficient basis for the U.S. to begin talking with North Korea. But the ball is now in U.S. court. What's for sure is that the plus alpha that the South Korean delegation is carrying to pass over to Washington will serve as a make it or break it factor in what could potentially become a historic turning point. Moon Gon-young, Arirang News, the Blue House.
President Moon Jae-in has hailed the recent interkorean agreement as a big step toward peace on the Korean peninsula. The South Korean leader made those comments this morning at the 50th annual Korea National Prayer Breakfast. Hwang Ho-jun reports.
President Moon Jae-in once again emphasized the significance of the outcome of the recent inter-Korean agreement while attending the Korean National Prayer Breakfast, marking its Jubilee year. Addressing the 5,000 attendees that included church leaders, politicians, and government officials, President Moon called the agreement a big step toward lasting peace and the denuclearization of the Korean peninsula. The president's remarks come a couple days after his top security advisor Chung Eui-yong and the head of the nation's intelligence agency, Seo-hun, returned from their high-profile trip to Pyongyang. They delivered news that the North has agreed to return to the negotiation table, even willing to discuss the issue of denuclearization, and will suspend all its military provocations as long as it's in dialogue with the U.S. The agreement also included Seoul and Pyongyang holding what would be a third inter-Korean summit late next month. President Moon stressed such achievements were made possible not only by talks between the Koreas, but also by strong U.S. support. However, he noted there are still obstacles to overcome, which, according to President Moon, are scars that have not healed because of the prolonged conflict and antagonism between the two Koreas.
우리의 운명을 남에게 맡길 수는 없는 노릇입니다. 미국을 비롯한 국제사회와 함께 손잡고 북한과 대화하며 한 걸음 한 걸음씩 한반도의 평화와 번영을 위한 초석을 놓겠습니다.
During the meeting, President Moon also expressed his gratitude for the role the Korean Church has played in South Korea's development and democratization and asked for the people's prayers for the future of the nation. Hwang Ho-jun, Arirang News.
The U.S. is remaining cautiously optimistic about the possibility of direct talks with North Korea after Pyongyang signaled this week that it's ready for dialogue. However, U.S. sanctions on the regime are here to stay. Treasury Secretary Stephen Mnuchin said this week that the sanctions are working, and unless North Korea decides to fully denuclearize, they will remain in place. Meanwhile, speaking to CBS on Wednesday, Republican Senator Cory Gardner expressed skepticism about Pyongyang's apparent willingness to hold talks. He noted how the U.S. has made mistakes in the past when it comes to promises of denuclearization by the North. And amid fears of a looming trade war and rising protectionism, finally, some good news for advocates of free trade. 11 countries are set to put pen to paper on a mega free trade deal in the coming hours. Kim Hae-sung reports.
A year after the U.S. withdrew from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the 11 remaining countries are due to sign a new agreement on Thursday in Chile. The deal, rebranded as the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, was revamped last year after 11 countries, including Japan, Australia, and Canada, agreed to keep the trade pact. Chile's top trade negotiator Felipe Lopiandia said the group moving forward after President Trump's retreat will send a political signal to the world and to the U.S. itself that this is a global agreement. The CPTPP drops around 20 clauses from the TPP, mainly over intellectual property regulations that had been demanded by the U.S. Washington's exit means a downsizing of the original trade pact, which with U.S. involvement represented around $28 trillion or 1/3 of world trade. The 11 remaining states represent over 13% of the world economy and 500 million people, greater than the European Union. The deal, which aims to cut import taxes to foster trade, will go into effect 60 days after it's ratified by at least 6 member countries. South Korea is not a member of the CPTPP, but it has bilateral free trade deals with 9 of the CPTPP members other than Japan and Mexico. Seoul's Trade Ministry says it will closely look into the CPTPP, analyze its economic effect, and decide whether it will join by the end of this year. The ministry added that it's looking into joining the Pacific Alliance trade bloc, including Mexico, Chile, Peru, and Colombia. Kim Hae-sung, Arirang News.
I'm David Whiting, and those are your news headlines for this hour.
The European Union is ready to retaliate against U.S. President Donald Trump's proposed tariffs on imported steel and aluminum by imposing higher tariffs on American-made goods. As a possible trade war looms between Brussels and Washington, the White House says Trump's tariff announcement may come by the end of this week. Our Kim Hyo-sun has more.
The EU has warned Washington that it will place tariffs on American-made products if the Trump administration follows through on its plan of imposing tariffs on imported steel and aluminum. In its latest rebuke to Trump's proposed tariffs, the world's biggest trading bloc said it would impose higher import duties on cranberries, industrial products, and other major goods made in the U.S. The EU is also mulling over filing an official complaint with the World Trade Organization, as well as raising safeguard tariffs to protect its steel industry against shipments diverting to the EU from the U.S. The EU's top trade official explained on Wednesday that President Trump's plan, a blanket tariff of 25% on imported steel and 10% on aluminum, would put thousands of European jobs in jeopardy.
I truly hope that this will not happen. But if it does happen, we will have to take measures to protect European jobs and workers.
While the commissioner also asked Washington to reconsider its new measures, the White House plans to make an announcement on the tariff plan by the end of this week. Meanwhile, following intense debate within the administration regarding President Trump's proposed tariffs, top economic advisor Gary Cohn has stepped down. Kim Hyo-sun, Arirang News.
And to tell us more about this, we're now joined by Professor Lee Jae-min from the Seoul National University School of Law. Welcome to the program.
Thank you. Great to be here.
All right, so the European Union says it's ready to retaliate against the U.S. over Trump's proposal of tariffs on steel and aluminum. So what's the situation like right now?
Well, right now, European Union and China are taking this issue very seriously, and they are really considering retaliation within the framework of the WTO. So they are now considering a serious retaliation against U.S. products from the United States to the European Union market. There's lots of products exported by the United States to EU and to China as well. So they are considering retaliation against the United States if the U.S. does go ahead with its own plan of tariff imposition on steels. And that may ignite, again, a global trade war. And that will put all of us, United States, EU, China, Japan, and Korea, in a very difficult situation, because now everybody is struggling to overcome their economic slowdown. We are recovering a little bit, but still many countries are struggling, including Korea. But this type of global protectionism and trade war will be a very ominous sign for all of us, including the United States.
It'll end up hurting all sides,
yes,
basically.
Yes, ultimately.
Now, there was some hope, though, that Trump's top economic advisor, Gary Cohn, who is known to be a free trade advocate, would somehow dissuade President Trump from imposing such high tariffs. But Cohn ended up resigning on Tuesday, further escalating the risk of a trade war between world superpowers.
Right. So I take it as a signal that the hardliners are winning in this national debate in the United States. This is a very controversial issue, even in the United States. This type of imposition of tariffs is very unique, something unheard of. I would say this is a creativity at its extreme. So very unique and unheard of, unprecedented measure. So not surprisingly, so there's a controversy and debate inside the United States. And now it seems that the hardliners are taking the center stage. And then President Trump is leaning toward the suggestions, arguments, and positions advocated by the hardliners in the government and also in the private sector, mainly from the steel industry as well.
So that's what made Cohn basically resign from his position.
Yes, it seems that way. So,
well, at this point, we kind of wonder if Trump's tariffs are indeed allowed under international law. I mean, are they compatible with World Trade Organization rules?
Well, that's a good question. And the short answer to that question is that many scholars believe that this type of imposition is not permitted under WTO agreements and FTA as well, so Korea-US FTA as well. There is a provision which talks about national security, so which is called a national security exception. But that provision has been there for about 60 years, from the 1947 GATT days, old GATT days from 1947. But when we say national security, we are basically talking about something like war or something serious national disaster. Imminent, national security disaster. Not like, well, this product is related to the maintenance of national security or something like that. So that's why I keep saying that this new discussion of Section 232 or the invocation of national security is something unheard of, because again, this provision in the old GATT and now new WTO agreement has been understood to cover situations like war or something very similar to war, but not like in a situation where, like now, where we see or where the U.S. government argues that steel is important for the production of weaponry.
Right.
So that is, again, something very unique and something creative.
Trump has been saying that his proposal on tariffs is backed up by international rights, right? And that's the provision you're talking about.
Yes. It's something debatable, but the majority view has been saying that this is related to a war, something similar to war. That's the issue here.
Now, what could be then some of the reasons behind Trump's shock decision to impose such high tariffs?
Well, when he was running for presidency in 2016, it was clear that he was trying to explore various options to protect the U.S. domestic industry. And steel industry and perhaps automobile industry and electronics industry are all in his priority list, particularly steel industry. Steel industry is very vocal and very active in the swing states of the United States, which can make important impact on U.S. presidential election. So he was advocating during his during his campaign for the presidency, he was advocating that he would pursue all avenues available when he becomes president. And now he is trying to consider various options at his disposal. And Section 232, national security, is one of the options. So on the one hand, he's trying to keep his word, which was made during his presidential election. Interesting thing is that this may not be the end of his effort. This may be the start of his or new U.S. administration's effort to explore various options on each table. So it may spread into other sectors, notably automobiles, semiconductors, vessels, all those types of products.
And some are also saying that the upcoming 2018 midterm elections in the U.S. could be one of the reasons.
Yes, I would agree with that observation. Midterm election is coming up soon, which is very important and vital to the remainder of Donald Trump's presidency. And to win the election, he needs to galvanize his supporting base. And the best way to galvanize his supporting base right now in the United States, perhaps anywhere in the world, is to pursue some protectionist measures and then try to get some support from the core supporters in his political camp.
But then, we heard that over 100 Republicans called on Trump to not impose such high tariffs on steel and aluminum. So how would such opposition possibly affect Trump's plan to sign off on these measures by the end of this week?
Well, yes, again, there's a controversy, and this is a very controversial issue in the United States, because many people say that this will actually hurt the interest of the United States. I think that assessment is actually correct. This may hurt the long-term interest of the United States. I'm not just talking about the impression or the leadership of the United States in abstract. Actually, the industry of the United States, industries of the United States, consumers and manufacturers of the United States will be harmed by this new measures of imposing tariffs on steel products. So this has been controversial, and I think the voices from the Congress are reflecting those conflicting views and concerns in the United States. That said, I think given the authority accorded to the President under the U.S. Constitution and the discretion, the wide latitude of discretion accorded to the President, I think it is still possible that the U.S. administration and President Trump can go ahead with the proposed plan, even with some opposition. Yes.
Okay,
yes.
So he will basically end up signing off on those measures in the end.
I think that seems the way that we are looking at.
All right. Now, what's interesting, though, is that Trump himself has been repeatedly courting the possibility of a trade war on Twitter, but then all of a sudden on Monday, he said that despite imposing all these tariffs on steel and aluminum, there needs to be no worry of a trade war. What can we make of this?
Yes. Every day we see very confusing and contradictory messages from his tweeters and statements. But I think he is trying to downplay the negative side of the upcoming trade war with the EU EU is a serious partner against the United States, and so is China. So he's trying to downplay the negative impact from the trade war with those trade giants. I think he is not actually, the point is not actually the real impact will be minimal, or impact will be small enough to disregard. I think the impact could be quite significant to the US economy, at least some key industries of the United States, agriculture, automobiles, they will be directly affected by the EU retaliatory measures.
Now, coming back here in Korea, some are saying that if this trade war ends up happening, actually, Korea will end up being the biggest victim. So how have the Korean won and local stocks reacted to this latest news?
Right. Korea, unfortunately, traditionally, Korea has been the biggest victim of any trade war. So EU has its own card. It has its own huge domestic market, which is the base for its own retaliation. Think about China. China, Japan, they also have a sizable domestic market, which provide basis for their economic retaliation against the United States. But we are not in that situation. At the same time, we are exporting a lot. Korea is the 7th largest exporter in the world.
Right.
Out of 164 WTO members, we are number 7. But we have a very small domestic market. So we can talk about retaliation, but our real impact could be very small, very limited in terms of the US perspective.
Right.
So that's our internal inherent limitation. So that said, Korea can try to cope with this situation, but nonetheless, we will end up not the, but one of the biggest victims of this trade war. And I think right now, the stock market and the exchange rate situation looks stable, but the situation is very volatile. If we do see a trade war sometime soon, then that will directly affect the Korean market situation in Seoul too, unfortunately.
All right. Then what are the chances that Trump may use these proposals on tariffs to pressure Korea amid ongoing negotiations on Korea's FTA?
Looks very likely.
Yeah.
They are closely related. So on the one hand, President Trump is including Korea in this big package of global retaliation, global protectionist scheme of his own. On the other hand, Korea and United States are now going through renegotiation process of the Korea-US FTA. So the situation of steel tariff imposition will be invoked by Korea against the United States, telling why the current FTA has a problem. On the other hand, United States will use the couple of trade measures, including the recent measure vis-a-vis Korea, saying that this is something we can consider if Korea can come up with something here or there in the Korea-US FTA. So this issue and other issues happening right now can be directly related to the Korea-US FTA renegotiation proceedings taking place now, probably until the end of the year.
All right. So our trade minister is currently in Washington, D.C., trying to get this matter resolved and get Seoul exempted from these proposed tariffs. Now, what are some of the measures that Korea could come up with in order to, I guess, fight against all this?
Right. There are a couple of measures that we can consider to cope with the recent development in the United States vis-a-vis Korea. We may try, in fact, we should try that the United States can consider excluding Korea in its plan of imposition of tariff rates. Right now, about a dozen countries are being contemplated in its package, and Korea can argue that Korea should be excluded. But again, the whole basis in the U.S. domestic law for this particular imposition is national security.
Right.
If it's national security, Korea could come number 1 in the group because Korea is probably the closest ally militarily with the United States. So if the real intent is the national security, Korea can make a strong argument that Korea has a reason to be excluded from the package, from the pact. But it's still too early to tell, and probably that is #1 priority for Minister Kim during his trip to Washington last week and this week.
All right, well, we'll definitely look forward to what comes out of his trip. Thank you so much for your insight today.
Thank you. Great to be here.
And that brings us to the end of our program, but make sure to tune into Arirang News for more domestic and global news updates throughout the day. Thanks for watching and see you soon.
The ever so awaited, mesmerising Pyeongchang. Finally here. Taking pictures with the cuties. We're just so amazed by the athletes' performances.